For ages, the Middle East has acted as a pivotal junction for empires, thanks to its strategic position linking Europe and Asia. The 20th century saw the unearthing of oil in the region, intensifying competition among global powers eager to tap into this lucrative resource. The aftermath of World War I solidified the influence of Britain and France in the area. At the same time, the Cold War saw the US and the Soviet Union engage in a high-stakes rivalry that escalated military tensions throughout the Middle East. As the British and French retreated and the Soviet Union disintegrated, the United States emerged as the preeminent foreign power, exerting influence in the region. But how can a single decision of the United States reshape the Middle East forever? How did it change the fate of the Middle East and ultimately lead to its destruction? History and USA's rooting its way in Middle East. The Arab Middle East has long been a focal point for global powers, including the United States and Russia. Their engagement with the region dates back to the 18th and 19th centuries. Under Ottoman rule, the US, an emerging power then, began formalizing its relationship with the Middle East in 1833 through a treaty of amity and commerce with the Sultanate of Oman. This diplomatic milestone was followed by the inauguration of an American consulate in Oman in 1838 and the subsequent recognition of the first Omani Arab diplomat in the United States. America's influence in the region wasn't confined to diplomatic and trade relations. It also encompassed educational, cultural, and humanitarian initiatives, including missionary efforts. After their victory in World War I, Britain and France assumed control over much of the former Ottoman Empire, holding mandates from the League of Nations. In contrast, the United States opted not to take on any regional appointments, earning a reputation for being both popular and respected across the Middle East. Indeed, Americans were often viewed as virtuous individuals, free from the European traits of self-interest and deceit. Agreements between the USA and the Middle East. Before World War II, the United States established various connections with the Middle East, including two key agreements focused on energy resources: the 1928 Red Line Agreement and the 1944 Anglo-American Petroleum Agreement were legally binding contracts highlighting America's interest in controlling Middle Eastern oil reserves. These agreements also underscored the U.S.'s strategic goal to inhibit the rise of a potential regional competitor. The Red Line Agreement, in particular, was part of a broader set of accords from the 1920s aimed at controlling oil supply and prices globally, mainly benefiting American companies. This agreement influenced Middle Eastern oil development for the subsequent 2 decades. The Anglo-American Petroleum Agreement of 1944 stemmed from U.S.-British negotiations over the governance of oil resources in the Middle East. Aftermath of World War II. At the onset of World War II, the United States was a powerhouse in global oil production, contributing a staggering 60% of the world's oil supply. This energy supremacy enabled the U.S. to sustain the war efforts of its allies, like Britain and France, while adversaries such as Germany and Japan faced energy constraints. However, as the war drew to a close, there was growing concern among American energy specialists that domestic oil reserves might be depleted soon. It prompted a shift in national security strategy to focus on securing overseas oil resources. Consequently, President Franklin D. Roosevelt initiated a diplomatic engagement with Saudi King Abdulaziz ibn Saud, whose nation had recently unearthed extensive oil deposits. Their meeting in February 1945 laid the foundation for a U.S.-Saudi relationship that endures to this day. Formation of Israel and Iran. The U.S.-Israel alliance, one of America's most enduring partnerships in the Middle East, was established on May 14, 1948. A mere 11 minutes after Israel proclaimed its independence, President Harry S. Truman officially recognized the fledgling nation. His motivations were multifaceted. Morally, he felt compelled to offer European Jews a sanctuary and homeland in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Politically, he saw a chance to garner Jewish electoral support in the U.S. ahead of the 1948 presidential race. And strategically, he believed that supporting Israel would serve as a bulwark against the spread of Soviet influence and communism in the region during the nascent stages of the Cold War. However, this decision had the unintended consequence of distancing the U.S. from Arab nations in the region who did not acknowledge Israel's legitimacy. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, a staunch nationalist opposed to foreign meddling in Iran, assumed the role of prime minister. He quickly moved to nationalize Iran's oil sector, a lucrative enterprise for Britain, via the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Mossadegh also severed all diplomatic relations with Britain. These actions alarmed Iran's Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who feared that an oil embargo would cripple Iran's economy. Workers in the oil industry, too, were anxious as they felt the economic pinch from sanctions triggered by Mossadegh's policies, leading to widespread unrest. As a result, the Shah asked Mossadegh to step down, invoking his constitutional authority. Mossadegh refused, sparking nationwide protests. Concerned for his safety, the Shah fled Iran, but appointed General Fazlullah Zahedi as the new prime minister. Unlike Mossadegh, Zahedi had no sympathies for the Communist Tudeh Party, a stance that aligned with U.S. fears about increasing Soviet influence in the Middle East. By late 1952, Britain sought U.S. assistance to oust Mossadegh. While President Harry S. Truman initially viewed Mossadegh as a safeguard against Soviet expansion, his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, was more aligned with British concerns. CIA Director Alan Dulles authorized $1 million in April 1953 to facilitate Mossadegh's removal. Consequences of Iran versus and Israel and USA's role. In the 1970s, Israel was a young nation, just 30 years old, and ostracized mainly by its Arab neighbors, having already engaged in 3 wars with them. In the aftermath of the 1973 Arab-Israel War, U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger arranged a set of agreements to resolve the ongoing conflict and balance U.S. interests between supporting Israel and maintaining good relations with Arab oil nations, particularly Saudi Arabia. Building on this groundwork, President Jimmy Carter took a pivotal step in 1978 to foster peace between Israel and Egypt. Despite deep-rooted mistrust, Egypt viewed a peace accord as a means to reclaim territories lost in the 1967 Six-Day War, strengthening its ties with the U.S. and revitalizing its faltering economy. Carter facilitated a 2-week confidential negotiation between the leaders of both nations, culminating in the historic Camp David Accords, which effectively removed Egypt, the most formidable Arab military power, from the conflict with Israel. For years, subsequent U.S. administrations have aimed to emulate the Camp David success. Still, only 4 other Arab nations, Bahrain, Jordan, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates, have formalized diplomatic relations with Israel. Iran and USA's controversial friendship. While Iran is currently one of America's most formidable adversaries in the Middle East, the relationship wasn't always so controversial. For much of the 20th century, the US and Iran were allies, united by mutual concerns over regional stability and oil interests. In a controversial move in 1953, the CIA supported a coup that ousted Iran's democratically elected prime minister to maintain the rule of the Shah, a pro-US leader. However, many Iranians viewed the Shah as a tainted figure, heavily influenced by America, whose regime was notorious for human rights abuses. This discontent reached a boiling point with the 1979 Islamic Revolution, which overthrew the Shah and installed a vehemently anti-Western government led by Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had previously been in exile. The revolution's aftermath saw Iranian students seizing the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and holding American personnel captive for 444 days. This crisis led to U.S. sanctions against Iran and a breakdown in diplomatic ties, a rift that persisted 4 decades later. In 1990, Iraq's invasion and subsequent annexation of Kuwait sparked global anger, leading the United Nations to call for an immediate Iraqi withdrawal. When Iraq defied this demand, the United States spearheaded a coalition of 38 nations, forming the most extensive military alliance since the Second World War to free Kuwait. U.S. President George H.W. Bush was concerned that an action could embolden Iraq's Saddam Hussein to set his sights on Saudi Arabia, thereby gaining control over a significant portion of the world's oil reserves. Bush also saw Iraq as a threat to Israel, especially given its chemical weapons capabilities. Moreover, he sought to uphold the international principle of territorial integrity. Over 500,000 U.S. soldiers participated in the Gulf War, swiftly overpowering Iraqi forces. However, the coalition stopped short of marching into Baghdad to oust Hussein, a task that would be undertaken by U.S. forces a decade later. After Iraq invaded Kuwait, a U.S.-led coalition defeated Iraq in the Persian Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. Despite the loss, Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party remained in power by brutally suppressing revolts among Kurds and Shiite Arabs. The coalition created a safe zone in northern Iraq to protect fleeing Kurds and enforced no-fly zones. The United Nations imposed economic sanctions to Iraq to curb its weapon programs, including nuclear, biological, and chemical arms. UN inspections in the mid-90s revealed various banned weapons, but Iraq's non-compliance led to U.S. airstrikes in 1998, known as Operation Desert Fox. Post-strikes, Iraq barred UN inspectors, and sanctions weakened as neighboring countries resumed trade with Iraq. When Saddam Hussein refused to step down, U.S.-led forces attacked Iraq, targeting a bunker where Saddam was believed to be. The invasion began from Kuwait, with special forces already in Kurdish-controlled areas. Contrary to fears, retreating Iraqi forces caused minimal damage. The main resistance came from the Ba'ath Party loyalists, known as Saddam's Fedayeen. In central Iraq, the Republican Guard defended Baghdad. U.S. forces advanced, briefly pausing due to weather and logistics, before capturing Baghdad's airport. Despite on-and-off yet disorganized resistance, U.S. forces took control of Baghdad, effectively ending major combat operations. Consequences of the 9/11 attacks. Following the tragic events of September 11, 2001, when al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 airplanes to carry out deadly attacks, killing 2,977 people, the U.S. Congress swiftly enacted the 2001 Authorization for Use of Military Force, AUMF. This legislation granted the U.S. President extensive authority to target those responsible for the attacks of their allies. However, the AUMF was notably ambiguous, lacking specific objectives or a defined time frame for its enforcement. This brief legislative act has since served as the legal basis for significant U.S. military and counterterrorism activities in the Middle East and globally. This includes the 2001 invasion of Afghanistan, targeted airstrikes against al-Qaeda offshoots in Somalia and Yemen, and even comprehensive surveillance of U.S. citizens. Nearly 20 years after its enactment, the AUMF continues to be cited as the legal justification for military interventions against groups like the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. In 2003, the U.S., under the leadership of President George W. Bush, initiated a contentious regime change mission in Iraq. This decision would significantly impact America's standing in the Middle East for years. The Bush administration argued that the operation aimed to topple Saddam Hussein's authoritarian government, which was suspected of harboring terrorists and possessing weapons of mass destruction. However, these claims were scrutinized when post-invasion inspections revealed no such weapons, and Iraq plunged into disorder. The human and financial toll of the invasion was staggering. Nearly 4,500 American soldiers lost their lives, and the war cost U.S. taxpayers close to $1 trillion. The intervention drew widespread criticism, regionally and internationally, leading to a reevaluation of U.S. foreign policy focused on regime change. Despite this, the U.S. continues to maintain a military presence in Iraq. By the end of 2006, President Bush had signaled his intent to augment troop numbers, although the specifics remained unclear. In January 2007, he unveiled a contentious strategy to temporarily boost U.S. military presence by over 20,000 troops, commonly called the Surge. While 2007 became the deadliest year for American forces since 2004, the subsequent decline in violence offered some encouragement. The efficacy of the Surge remains a topic of ongoing debate, as multiple factors contributed to the reduced violence levels. While U.S. military casualties were meticulously recorded, data on Iraqi casualties remained elusive for several years. It wasn't until October 2009 that the Iraqi government released its figures, revealing that over 85,000 Iraqis, both civilians and military, had died violently between 2004 and 2008. In late 2008, the Iraqi parliament endorsed a U.S.-Iraq accord that set new legal guidelines for American military operations in Iraq, including a timeline for troop withdrawal. Finalized during the waning days of President George W. Bush's term, the agreement mentioned that U.S. forces would vacate Iraqi cities by the middle of 2009 and exit the country entirely by the end of 2011. When President Obama took office in 2009, he confirmed that American combat troops would leave Iraq by August 31, 2010, with the residual forces departing by the close of 2011. True to this commitment, the last U.S. combat brigade left Iraq on August 18, 2010, 2 weeks ahead of schedule, leaving 50,000 troops for transitional duties. Current state and relation between USA and Middle East. In 2011, the Arab Spring ignited protests across the Middle East, demanding reforms from authoritarian regimes. In Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi threatened a brutal crackdown, posing a dilemma for President Obama. He could either intervene militarily, risking another Middle Eastern quagmire, or stand aside, potentially allowing a humanitarian disaster. Obama chose to rally international support for limited humanitarian intervention. The lack of a post-conflict strategy for Libya led to ongoing civil strife, a situation President Obama later described as the worst mistake of his presidency. The United States and Saudi Arabia share a common goal of combating terrorism and have maintained a strong alliance. In 2017, President Donald Trump announced a deal to supply Saudi Arabia with $115 billion in military equipment, including tanks, naval vessels, and missile defense systems. By 2018, Saudi Arabia had already acquired over $14.5 billion of U.S. weaponry. However, the alliance faced scrutiny when a U.S. supply bomb was used by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen to strike a school bus, resulting in the deaths of 40 children. This incident and the broader humanitarian crisis in Yemen led to widespread condemnation of U.S. support for Saudi military actions, which were implicated in the deaths of thousands of children. In response, the U.S. Senate voted in December 2018 to terminate American assistance to Saudi Arabia's Yemen campaign. This decision, withdrawal support for Saudi Arabia's military intervention in Yemen, strained the relationship between the two nations. As a result, Saudi Arabia declined when the United States requested an increase in oil production, signaling a cooling of relations between the two long-standing allies. President Joe Biden, like his three predecessors, had been unwavering in his stance against Iran acquiring nuclear weapons, emphasizing in a 2022 interview that a nuclear-armed Iran would exacerbate the already tense situation, despite efforts to revive the 2015 nuclear agreement, which was abandoned by President Trump in 2018. Progress stalled by 2021. As we reach the end of the video, it is clear that the involvement of the USA in the Middle East has been multifaceted, driven by a combination of strategic, economic, and political interests. But whether the USA disrupted the Middle East is still debatable. What do you think? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. While it's an oversimplification to say the USA destroyed the Middle East, there's no denying that American interventions, both direct and indirect, have played a significant role in shaping the current dynamics of the region. As of 2023, the US maintains diplomatic ties with all Middle Eastern nations, excluding Iran and Syria. The current focal points for the US government in the region encompass finding a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute and curbing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, with a special emphasis on Iran. If you find this video interesting, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel to get more from the world of American history and politics.